I'm Deputy Division Director at FDEP over our Division of Environmental Assessment and Restoration, and I'm the Deputy over our Water Quality Standards Program and our laboratories up in Tallahassee. So we're here today to talk about our Triennial review process. So this is where we're having a conversation with you about what we're thinking about doing as far as revising our water quality criteria and any thoughts that you may have about criteria you think need revising. We're going to have Daryl DeWinter, our program administrator, starting things off. Ken Weaver, who's another administrator, environmental administrator in the Water Quality Standards Program. Caitlin Sutton over here. And we also have Kenny Heyman with our Office of General Counsel present today. So I think we're going to go through some slides. There's speaker forms over there if you definitely have a question you want us to address and you want to get that into the record. As we're going through it, if you have a clarifying question that you want to ask, something that would just take a second or two going back and forth to clarify, just so you are all on the same page with what we're trying to explain or communicate to you. I'm happy to have that back and forth there, but otherwise we'll wait to the end for any more lengthy dialogue back and forth. And then when we get to that portion, if we can kind of limit it to maybe 3 minutes and then some response, and that way we can get through everybody. We have a good turnout. I'm glad you all made it out here. As we were driving in, we're kind of like, ooh, this is a little bit back there. I hope everybody's okay with this. So what do you think about this location? You like it? Yeah, it's beautiful. Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Daryl. Thank you all for coming out here. We're interested to have a little dialogue about what you think about what we're proposing and what you'd like to see.
All right, good morning. One little minor thing, just legally we're supposed to warn you that we are recording this meeting and we do not create a transcript of the meeting, but we do try to prepare a little summary, and that really helps us augment the summary. And also sometimes people ask us for a copy of the recording. We can send you that. We will prepare this summary, and we like to get people's name and affiliation into that summary. That's why we ask for it on the speaker cards, and while I'll probably ask you as you make comments, because it really helps with that summary. We do have a little bit of a lighting issue. That slide is clearly hard to read, but can people read at this lighting level? Read that okay? Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So this first slide just covers the agenda, of course. Talk a little bit about the purpose of the trial review and the purpose of this meeting. Give you a little bit of background about the trial review very quickly. Won't be going into much history there. And the scope of the trial review. And then basically what our plan for today, well, the real purpose of today is to hear from you, but we found that people want to hear what we're thinking of first, so you can kind of react to it. So the presentation is set up to kind of go chapter by chapter through all of our rules, which are those 4. Go through those is what we're thinking about changing as far as this trial review. And we're not, we've been thinking about this for the last year or so, working on what should be queued up for this trial review. Then I have one slide about the economic analysis information that we'll eventually need. It's a little premature now, but I like to plant that seed. Then I'll talk about the tentative schedule moving forward for the trial review. And one thing I want to emphasize is this really is the starting place of this effort. Some people were a little bit confused if you looked at our notice of rules of development that we send out. I know mainly just lawyers and their staff read it, but it gets around. But in there, we call this meeting a workshop/hearing. And the reason why we called it a hearing because the federal regs refer to this kickoff meeting as a hearing. But that we found out that confused some people because they thought usually in the state of Florida, the term hearing is reserved for when you're about to adopt something. We are not about to adopt something. This is the starting process. So I can't emphasize that enough. And then we'll get to the public, going back to the agenda, then we'll get to this public comments and recommendations. So as far as the purpose, I'd like to start broad. DEP has a mission to protect, conserve, and manage the state's natural resources. And to me, the water quality standards are the foundation for our protection efforts. They provide the healthy conditions that we're trying to conserve. They provide the water quality targets for our assessment and our restoration programs. And they really provide us the tools to protect and manage our resources. Now, more specifically for the Toronto Review, the purpose of this meeting is, it's almost like a rapid improvement process, but not that rapid. A continuous improvement process. Every Toronto Review, we're trying to improve our water quality standards. And so we're going to share our thoughts on how to do that. I want to hear your thoughts on how to improve our water quality standards. As far as the genesis of the Toronto Review, the Clean Water Act is the genesis. It requires states and approved tribes to periodically conduct a comprehensive review of their water quality standards. It's known as the Toronto Review because the implementing federal regulations require that periodically they translate that into every 3 years. As far as the state of Florida, our last official, what we called the Toronto Review, was completed as far as adoption by the Environmental Regulation Commission in December of 2015, and then EPA approved those rule revisions in July of 2017. It's hard to know exactly when a Toronto Review ends, but it's clearly time to start one up. Yes, Martin?
The last Environmental Regulation Commission, the vote went 3-2 to try and supersede EPA's numerics with our probabilistic, but did not the Indians and someone else sue to prevent that from happening afterwards?
Yeah, so what the comment there is relating to, we actually did we do other rulemaking outside the Toronto Review. We did human health criteria rulemaking and took it to the ERC in July of 2016, so subsequent to this last rulemaking I was just talking about. And in that case, the ERC did adopt it or approved it for adoption. We adopted it, and it was challenged by several parties. The administrative process is amazingly slow, and there was all the way, it actually never occurred. There was a hearing about administrative issues. Don't want to get into all the details, but the key of this storyline is that in February of last year, we withdrew those criteria. And I guess I'm going to jump ahead. I was going to plan to talk about this later, but so in February of last year, we withdrew those criteria, and we announced that we were starting a fish consumption survey, a statewide fish consumption survey that we hope to kick off July 1. We have a contract with the University of Florida. And what we're doing is, one of the very controversial parts of that rulemaking, or one of the key input variables in calculating human health criteria is what amount of fish people eat. And we had used it's called NHANES, the National Health Survey, as our input for the fish consumption values. And people wanted us to use Florida-specific data. The only Florida-specific data we had was dating back nearly 30 years. So anyway, what we've decided to do is do a fish consumption survey for the state of Florida. I think that's the good news. The bad news is that survey process is going to take a long time. The survey itself takes 14 months because you want to include seasonal differences in consumption. But anyway, the bottom line of all that is we will not be including human health criteria in this Toronto Review while we do that survey. And so we'll have other criteria we're working on, but those human health ones we're not planning to include. So Marty, I gave you a lot more information than you asked it, but did that answer your question?
That's what I need. Thank you, sir.
All right.
So this TR is overdue.
Well, it depends on how you count it. I would say it's basically on schedule, because of the way EPA, does it start when EPA approves the action or when we adopt the action?
And it took 2 years for that. Let's see, in 2015, 2017. And, if you use the 2017 number, we're going to be waiting another 2 years. I mean, today's the 19th, we're going to wait another 2 years because you're just beginning it now.
Yeah, well, y'all hear later that we hope to finish this by the end of the calendar year.
The presentation from today is posted to our website, and
I'll
all the slides?
Yes. So you don't need to be.
So what's the website?
Well, I just Googled it. So if you look at Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and then you, I guess you could search standards, but I always go to DEER, that's our division. It lists all the divisions.
D-E-R or D-E-A?
Well, it's DEAR, but there's a pick list of divisions, and there's one division of environmental assessment and restoration. And I'm sure I'm not telling you the most efficient way to get there.
Can I chime in? Julie, I found it by just Googling up Triennial Review DEP, and it takes you right on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the way it's set up right now in their Toronto review, it has one little short paragraph, and then it shows the three locations of the meetings that we're holding. At the end, we increased the font for the PowerPoint, so you'll see a bigger font where it says the link to the PowerPoint. All right, so now as far as the Toronto review, the general expectation is that we review all of our water quality standards, but specifically we look at what EPA has done since the last time we did a Toronto review. What new recommended criteria have come out, and you'll hear a little bit about some of those. Cadmium's an example, selenium's another example that EPA has revised in the last 3 years. But we've certainly done that, but there's other criteria out there that we want to look at. And another thing I wanted to emphasize is that when EPA recommends a criteria, it truly is a recommendation. We are required to consider that, but we do not have to follow that recommendation. What we are required to do is provide an explanation if we decide not to follow it. Excuse me, do you have a question?
It just seems like I get so frustrated because so much money goes into studies and then, well, maybe we won't follow that.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then it's one delay after another where a problem is not being solved.
Well, for the most part, and that's a good jumping off point, for the most part, all aquatic life criteria that EPA recommends, we have historically adopted them as EPA recommended them, with one exception. They usually propose an acute value and a chronic value. The acute value is, it's a higher number that you can't exceed in a single sample, and the chronic value is usually a 4-day average, or some average number that's a little bit lower. And we have, throughout the program's history that I know, we have only adopted the chronic number, but applied it like it was an acute number. So it's expressed as a 4-day average by EPA, but we apply it as a single sample max. So that is a conservative way of taking EPA's recommendations and applying them. The thing that Marty is reacting to is on the human health criteria side. EPA definitely recommends that states try to tailor their criteria for the state-specific conditions, like state-specific fish consumption, or other factors related to the environmental conditions in the state. And that's what we tried to do back in 2016, is tailor those numbers. And some of the methodology that we use that people didn't like, but that methodology was a methodology that EPA actually thinks is a good methodology. I don't want to get too much into that, but anyway, we generally follow EPA's recommendations for all the aquatic life criteria. All right, so as far as the scope of this Toronto review, it's really all of our water quality standards. And it's weird because most people, when they think water quality standards, they only think of 302, surface water quality standards. That's where the vast majority of our water quality standards are, but we actually have some in Chapter 62.4 permits, and I'll show those in a minute. We also, 62-303, which is most people call the IWR, the Impaired Waters Rule. All of that was adopted as a change to water quality standards. And then lastly, Chapter 62.304, total maximum daily loads. This is the first Toronto review that we've needed to include that chapter, and it's because under our numeric nutrient criteria rulemaking that we did really from 2011 through 2016, we revisions for nutrient criteria call for nutrient TMDLs to be considered the site-specific interpretation of the nutrient criteria, and therefore are a change to water quality standards. So the nutrient TMDLs in 304 are water quality standards. So we issued a notice of rule development for those 4 chapters, published it in March of this year, and we listed all the sections that we consider part of water quality standards. And basically, all those are open for comment today, and anything else that you think are relevant to water quality standards. So now I'm going to shifting gears into going through the chapter by chapter, what we're thinking of. And this first one is actually a pretty easy one because we're not actually have any queued up changes to 62.4. So I want you to see the rule sections that are water quality standards. So in 62.4, we've got 62.4.242, that's where anti-degradation and outstanding Florida waters are in that rule provision. And anti-degradation is clearly part of our water quality standards. 62.4.243 is some exemptions from water quality standards. I don't know if those are actually ever used anymore, or very rarely, if any. 62.4.244 is mixing zones, that's certainly used. And the way the system is set up is the mixing zone rule is a water quality standard. When we issue an individual mixing zone, that's not a change to water quality standards. I just wanted you to notice that subtle difference. But that makes the rule very important to understand how that's then going to be implemented. And then lastly, 62-4246, a rule I generally refer to as the MDL PQL rule, but it addresses method detection limits and practical quantification limits, but method detection limits for water pollution sources. That is deemed to be a water quality standard. But again, as that slide says at the bottom, we don't have any planned changes in that section at this time. And now we're going to shift speakers to Ken Weaver, who's going to go through the harder rule, the 62-302, and then we'll jump back to me for the other chapters.
All right, thank you. So, as Daryl kind of alluded to, 62.302 is our main water quality standards chapter or rule, and this is where a lot of our changes are going to occur for this triennial. And I'm just going to start out with some of the potential changes we're looking at. And this first one is actually one of those EPA 304A recommendations. So what we are considering looking at is revising our marine and freshwater cabining criteria. This would be based on a 2016 EPA recommendation. The cabining criteria are designed to protect aquatic life, fish and other organisms that live in the water. If we were to do this, the marine criterion, based on EPA's recommendation, would decrease from a concentration of 8.8 micrograms per liter and go to 7.9 micrograms per liter. Freshwater criterion is a little more complicated. It has been for decades. EPA bases a lot of the metals criterion in freshwater on hardness. This new criterion is hardness based, but I will note that based on some new toxicity data, that's what EPA is looking at, aquatic toxicity lab results, the criterion, if we were to adopt this, would go up approximately by a factor of 3, depending on the hardness associated with the sample. So, for example, at a hardness of 100 milligrams per liter, the criterion would go from the current 0.27 micrograms per liter to 0.72 micrograms per liter. So again, about a 3-fold increase. Second thing we're looking at is, I just wanted to go back to that triennial review Daryl talked about in 2015. We adopted an EPA recommendation for anaerobic oxide and E. coli bacteria to protect recreational uses in the water. Those criteria include both a monthly geometric mean and what we call the TPTV. The TPTV is a 10% threshold value that is assessed over a monthly period. And one of the issues we've run into is there's some confusion about how to interpret this TPTV value if there's fewer than 10 samples in a month. And what we're going to clarify, we're thinking about clarifying, is that if there's less than 10 samples in a month, then effectively becomes a single sample maximum. The 10% no longer comes into play. So that's just a clarification. Third thing we're looking at, this is something we've been working on internally. This is a state initiative. It's not an EPA recommendation, although we've kind of communicated with EPA, as well as not just standard section, but our Resilience and Coastal Protection Office and some of our dredging permitting folks. But EPA has been engaged in this, but this is something we're pushing. What we're thinking about doing is improving our turbidity criterion to better protect corals and hard-bottom communities, particularly down in southeast Florida. If you're familiar with the current criterion, it's been on the books for 40, 50 years. It is 29 NTUs above natural background. That was never designed with corals in consideration, and we've got a lot of information that really suggests that corals are very sensitive to increased turbidity, and that criterion is not protected. We really don't think it's protected. So what we're thinking about doing is revising that criterion. I've had my staff look through the literature on laboratory studies and field-based studies, both here and abroad. There are a lot of studies out of Australia. We've got different coral species. There are some studies in the Caribbean and some here that clearly show that corals are sensitive at about well below 29 NTU, maybe 7 or 10 or even lower, but we don't have enough data to really bright line a numeric number that would be protective. I had a question back there.
Do you know of any, sorry, I'm not really well. Do you know of any of those studies with regards to the coral are including the sources of turbidity, be they organic biomass or just inorganic suspended solids?
There's a range of studies. My folks have primarily tried to look at turbidity or TSS, but one of the things that has made this difficult to bright line that concentration is just the sediment quality. The mix of what's there really affects the grain size, what's the source, the amount of organics. That really affects the response, and that's part of the reason we're headed the route I'm going to talk about in a moment, but we still want to try to bright line that number.
So what if there's something else that's affecting the coral besides turbidity? You're not gonna look at that?
I wouldn't say we're not going to look at it. This is focused on turbidity.
Because the corals are dying.
Corals are dying, yes. And there's an issue. We have our Coastal Resilience Office looking at that. They're doing a lot of studies. We're looking at all the factors that are affecting corals. This is the one we're looking at right here.
But you won't be able, even though you're looking at those factors, they won't be factored into this 3-year study, or whatever.
That would not be directly factored into this criteria.
It won't change.
We would deal with it through other criteria or other,
Tell me after.
or other restoration activities. Yes, sir.
For a specific region, how do you establish your natural background, time-wise?
We are working on that, and one of the things I'm going to mention here a little later on is that we want to adopt an implementation document that explains how to do this. Our next round of workshops, we want to get that out there. We want feedback, but you're absolutely right. We need to establish that background, and we're going to talk about that in the implementation document, but we're still trying to work it out ourselves. Yes, Barney.
This morning, they have detected an algal bloom in Lake Okeechobee. There were points in the last 2 years where we were 90% covered by satellite, which may not have truly explained how deep that stuff was. Science has shown that when toxic cyanobacteria dies, it drops its hepatotoxins, neurotoxins, and nutrients into the water column right where they're at. So we have a lake that's 90% covered. The water cools, whatever, it dies. It's now in the sediment. You discharge into the C-44, and we get a friggin' 1 million pounds dumped into the St. Lucie, and nobody is looking at the toxicity. Nobody has looked at the transport of BMAA through these things. And I live in Rio. We tested positive, so I have great concern about sediments. They didn't really bother me a year ago, but now that I know what they're carrying, it scares the hell out of me. Is there any mechanism in there to look at that, or are we just looking at the turbidity aspect of the sediment?
We can address the issue about the cyanotoxins or cyanobacteria separately, but let's get through the turbidity part, and then we can address the other.
Okay, that's fine, thanks.
Yeah.
I know, but we're not.
So, back up a little bit, we've talked about this a little bit. So what we are doing, because we can't bright line that specific numeric threshold that's protective of the corals, and to be clear, that's what criteria do. They bright line they're a numeric value that are protective. So what we are exploring is kind of adding a narrative approach to better protect all waters and specifically corals from turbidity. And Daryl in some of these meetings has noted the irony that both he and I have spent the last 10 years trying to get away from a narrative for nutrients, and here we are kind of talking about a narrative for turbidity, but we think it is a good solution, at least for now, and there is a certain strength in it. But just want to put some of these ideas out there and get thoughts from the public. So what we're thinking about doing is taking that current turbidity criterion that's in Rule 62, 302, 530. It currently says turbidity shall not be increased above 29 MTUs above natural background. We would make that a Part A and add this narrative to it that would apply to all waters. And one of the questions that came up in Tallahassee, does that include fresh waters? And we were thinking that it would include both fresh and marine waters. And this narrative would say that nor shall turbidity levels be increased to levels that negatively affect designated uses or result in increased sedimentation or reduced light transmission to the bottom to the point that the normal growth function, reproduction, or recruitment of aquatic life is impaired. So it's getting at the various ways that turbidity affects aquatic life, either through sedimentation, interfering with filtration of the organisms when they feed, or reduced light transmission. Then we would add kind of a Part B that specifically gets at corals and hard-bottom communities that would say something along the lines of turbidity shall not be increased above background conditions within areas that have corals and important hard-bottom communities. We would allow or would consider natural variability around this background condition in the turbidity. That would be part of what's being dealt with in that implementation document I mentioned. Yes, Diana.
And the natural variability for the St. Lucie estuary, would that include Lake Okeechobee discharges?
Lake Okeechobee, it's going to be a difficult thing to tease out, but I would say no, because I wouldn't say the Lake Okeechobee discharges are natural.
Okay, I just wanted that clarified.
Yeah.
On camera.
On camera, okay. So if we take this approach, I already mentioned that we would have to develop some type of implementation document that explains how we take into account those background conditions. We've had some discussion about that and interpret that natural variability. And this would be primarily for 303D listing, IWR listing purposes, as well as permitting. And when I say permitting, most of what is going to affect the turbidity in these areas are dredging projects and beach nourishment. Could be some of the discharges like at Lake Okeechobee. We are thinking about either incorporating a map by reference that would show the areas that have corals, or just add a narrative that the criteria applies wherever coral communities and hard bottoms are found, or some kind of hybrid of those two. And I'll show this map that really does not show them.
That red light in the back,
So, what we're looking at doing is the areas that have extensive coral reefs in the state kind of range from offshore Martin County down to Monroe County. There's reefs, there's actually acropora, staghorn, elkhorn, coral, critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act in these areas. So we thought it was important to specifically list these areas. And these areas that could be depicted in this map include Biscayne Bay National Park, Dry Tortugas National Park, Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area. That last one was designated by the 2018 Florida Legislature as a new special area